Chapter 1. It might, perhaps, be advisable to say here, since the reader may have been glancing ahead, that this is not a book about occultism, and not a book about what is called psychoanalysis. It is merely the account of an extremely cautious reconnaissance in a rather novel direction, an account presented in the customary form of a narrative of the actual proceedings concerned, coupled with a statement of the theoretical considerations believed to be involved, and the dramatic, seemingly bizarre character of the early part of the story need occasion the reader no misgivings. He will readily understand that the task which had to be accomplished at that stage was the isolating of a single, basic fact from an accumulation of misleading material. Any account of any such process of separation must contain, of course, some description of the stuff from which the separation was effected. And such stuff very often is, and in this case very largely was, rubbish. There does not appear to be anything in these pages that anyone is likely to find difficult to follow, provided that he avoids, in chapters 17, 19, XXI, 23, XIV and XXVI, those occasional paragraphs enclosed within square brackets which have been written more particularly for specialists. And Part 5 may require reading twice. But there are a few commonplace semi-technical expressions which will crop up now and again, and it is always possible that other people may be accustomed to attach to these words meanings rather different from those which the present writer is hoping to convey. Any such misunderstanding would result, obviously, in our being at cross purposes throughout the greater part of the book. Hence it might be advisable for us to come to some sort of rough preliminary agreement, not as to how these terms ought rightly to be employed, but as to what they are to be regarded as meant to mean in this particular volume. By so doing we shall, at any rate, avoid that worst of all irritations to a reader, a text repeatedly interrupted by references to footnote or glossary. That the agreement will be entirely one-sided will make it all the easier to achieve. Chapter 2. Briefly, then, let us suppose that you are entertaining a visitor from some country where the inhabitants are all born blind, and that you are trying to make your guest understand what you mean by seeing. You discover, we will further assume, that the pair of you have, fortunately, this much in common: you are both thoroughly conversant with the meanings of all the technical expressions employed in the physical sciences. Using this ground of mutual understanding, you endeavor to explain your point. You describe how, in that little camera which we call the eye, certain electromagnetic waves radiating from a distant object are focused onto the retina, and there produce physical changes over the area affected, how these changes are associated with currents of a nervous energy in the criss-cross of nerves leading to the brain centers, and how molecular or atomic changes at those centers suffice to provide the seer with a registration of the distant object's outline. All this your visitor could appreciate perfectly. Now, the point to be noticed is this. Here is a piece of knowledge concerning which the blind man had no previous conception. It is knowledge which he cannot, as you can, acquire for himself by the ordinary process of personal experiment. In substitution, you have offered him a description, framed in the language of physical science. And that substitute has served the purpose of conveying the knowledge in question from yourself to him. But in seeing there is, of course, a great deal more than mere registration of outline. There is, for example, color. Chapter 2. Briefly, then, let us suppose that you are entertaining a visitor from some country where the inhabitants are all born blind, and that you are trying to make your guest understand what you mean by seeing. You discover, we will further assume, that the pair of you have, fortunately, this much in common: you are both thoroughly conversant with the meanings of all the technical expressions employed in the physical sciences. Using this ground of mutual understanding, you endeavor to explain your point. You describe how, in that little camera which we call the eye, certain electromagnetic waves radiating from a distant object are focused onto the retina, and there produce physical changes over the area affected, how these changes are associated with currents of a nervous energy in the criss-cross of nerves leading to the brain centers, and how molecular or atomic changes at those centers suffice to provide the seer with a registration of the distant object's outline. All this your visitor could appreciate perfectly. Now, the point to be noticed is this. Here is a piece of knowledge concerning which the blind man had no previous conception. It is knowledge which he cannot, as you can, acquire for himself by the ordinary process of personal experiment. In substitution, you have offered him a description, framed in the language of physical science. And that substitute has served the purpose of conveying the knowledge in question from yourself to him. But in seeing there is, of course, a great deal more than mere registration of outline. There is, for example, color. So you continue somewhat on the following lines. That which we call a red flame sets up electromagnetic waves of a certain length, a blue flame sets up waves exactly similar save only that they differ slightly in this matter of length. The visual organs are so constituted that they sort out waves showing such disparity in length, and this in such a way that these differences are finally registered by corresponding differences in those physical changes which occur at the brain centers. From the point of view of your blind guest, this description, also, would be entirely satisfactory. He could now understand perfectly how it is that a physical brain is able to register wavelength difference. And, if you were content to leave it at that, he would depart gratefully convinced that the language of physics had again proved equal to the task, and that your description in physical terms had equipped him with a knowledge of, for instance, what other people call red as complete in every respect as that which they themselves possess. But this supposition of his would be absurd. For concerning the existence of one very remarkable characteristic of red he would still, obviously, know nothing whatsoever. And that characteristic is its redness. Redness? Yes. Without bothering about whether redness be a thing or a quality or an illusion or anything else, there is no escaping the fact that it is a characteristic of red of which you and all-seeing people are very strongly aware, nor the further fact that your visitor, so far, would have not the faintest shadow of an idea that you or others experience anything of the kind, or, indeed, that there could exist anything of the kind to be experienced. If, then, you intend to complete your self-imposed task of bringing his knowledge on the subject of seeing up to the same level as your own, there remains yet another step before you. Realizing this, you mentally glance down your list of physical expressions, and a moment's inspection is enough to show you that, for the purpose of conveying to your blind guest a description of redness, there is not a single one of these expressions which is of the slightest use whatsoever. You might talk to him of particles, and describe these as oscillating, spinning, circling, colliding, and rebounding in any kind of complicated dance you cared to imagine. But in all that there would be nothing to introduce the notion of redness. You might speak of waves, big waves, little waves, long waves, and short waves. But the idea of redness would still remain unborn. You might hark back to the older physics, and descant upon forces, magnetic, electrical, and gravitational, or you might plunge forward into the newer physics, and discourse of non-Euclidean space and Gaussian coordinates. And you might hold forth on such lines until exhaustion supervened, while the blind man nodded and smiled appreciation, but it is obvious that, at the end of it all, he would have no more suspicion of what it is that you immediately experience when you look at a field poppy than he had at the outset. Physical description cannot here provide the information which experience could have given. Now, redness may not be a thing, but it is very certainly a fact. Look around you. It is one of the most staring facts in existence. It challenges you everywhere, demanding, clamoring to be accounted for. And the language of physics is fundamentally unadapted to the task of rendering that account. It is obvious that dubbing redness an illusion would not help the physicist. For how could physics set about describing or accounting for the entry of the element of redness into that illusion? The universe pictured by physics is a colorless universe, and in that universe all brain happenings, including illusions, are colorless things. It is the intrusion of color into that picture, whether as an illusion or under any other title, which requires to be explained. Once you have thoroughly realized that redness is something beyond a complex of positions, a complex of motions, a complex of stresses, or a mathematical formula, you will have little difficulty in perceiving that color is not the only fact of this kind. If your hypothetical visitor were deaf, instead of blind, you could never, by giving him books of physics to read, arouse in him even the beginning of a suspicion regarding the nature of a sound, as heard. Now, sound, as heard, is a fact. But in the world described by physics there is no such fact to be found. All that physics can show us is an alteration in the positional arrangement of the brain particles, or alterations in the tensions acting upon those particles. And in no catalogue of the magnitudes and directions of such changes could there be anything to suggest that there exists anywhere in the universe a phenomenon such as that which you directly experience when a bell tolls. In fact, just as physics cannot deal with the element of redness in red, so is it inherently unable to account for the intrusion of that clear bell note into a universe which it can picture only as an animated diagram of groupings, pushings, and pullings. But if, in such a diagram, there can be nothing of either color or sound, is it likely to be of any use our hunting therein for phenomena like taste and smell? The utmost that we could hope to find would be those movements of the brain particles which accompany the experiences in question. Or, possibly, some day, the transference equations relating to some hitherto unsuspected circuit of energy. Your hypothetical visitor and yourself might each possess the fullest possible knowledge of these brain disturbances, the most complete acquaintance with such energetic equations as may still remain to be written, but if you could actually taste and smell, and he could not, it is incontrovertible that your knowledge of each of these phenomena would include something quite unknown to, and, indeed, quite unimaginable by, him. Now, when we say of any occurrence that it is physical, we mean thereby that it is potentially describable in physical terms. So it is perfectly correct to state that, in every happening with which our sensory nerves are associated, we find, after we have abstracted therefrom every known or imaginable physical component, certain categorically non-physical residua. But these remnants are the most obtrusive things in our universe. So obtrusive that, aided and abetted by our trick of imagining them as situated at our outer nerve endings, or as extending beyond those endings into outer space, they produce the effect of a vast external world of flaming lights and colors, pungent scents, and clamorous, tumultuous sounds. Collectively, they bulk into a most amazing tempest of sharply differentiated phenomena. And it is a tempest which remains to be considered after physics has completed its say. Physics. Nor is this last a matter for wonderment. For the ideal object of physics is to seek out, isolate, and describe such elements in nature as may be credited with an existence independent of the existence of any human observer. Physics is, thus, a science which has been expressly designed to study, not the universe, but the things which would supposedly remain in that universe if we were to abstract therefrom every effect of a purely sensory character. From the very outset, then, it renounces all interest in such matters as those colors, sounds, etc., of which we are directly aware, matters essentially dependent upon the presence of a human observer, and non-existent in his absence, and it limits itself to a language and a set of conceptions serviceable only for the description of facts pertaining to its own restricted province. Psychology and psychical. But as scientific investigators of the situation in which we find ourselves, we cannot, of course, neglect to study a mass of phenomena so large and so obtrusive as to constitute, to first appearance, the whole of the world we know. Consequently, a separate science has gradually arisen which endeavors to deal with these and other of the rather bulky leavings of physics. This science is called a psychology, and the facts with which it deals are dubbed a mental, or, more commonly, psychical. Chapter 3 now, although it is scientifically indisputable that the brain, regarded as a purely physical piece of mechanism, cannot create, unassisted and out of nothingness, any of those vivid psychical appearances we call color, sound, taste, etc., it may be taken as experimentally established that these phenomena do not come into existence unless accompanied by some stimulation of the corresponding sense organs. Moreover, they vary in character according to the character of the sense organ involved. Lights and colors accompany activities of the optic nerves. Sounds are associated with the existence of ears, tastes with palates. The psychical phenomena are different where the sensory organizations are different. Color experiences in man range from violet to deep red, according to the wavelengths of the electromagnetic rays impinging upon the eye. If that wavelength be further slightly increased, the associated psychical experience is one of heat alone. But we know that, with a very little modification of the sensitive optical elements involved, those heat experiences would be accompanied by experiences of a visible infrared color. Thus, the physical brain, though it cannot create such sensory appearances, is a prime factor in their characterization, and, for that reason, an important factor in whatever process it may be that causes them to appear. The situation, thus far, is usually summed up in the cautious statement that these particular kinds of psychical phenomena, on the one hand, and their corresponding sense organ stimulations, on the other, invariably accompany one another, or run, so to say, on parallel tracks in time. This, be it noted, is never advanced as an explanation. It is merely supposed to be a simple way in which the facts can be announced without dragging in the various metaphysical creeds favored by the various announcers. Psychoneural parallelism. The assumption that this parallelism of psychical and neural events extends to all observable thought experience, that there is no observable psychical activity without some corresponding activity of brain, is called psychoneural parallelism, the activity in either class being referred to as the correlator of that in the other. The accumulated evidence in favor of this view is practically overwhelming. Hard thinking induces brain fatigue, drugs which poison the brain interfere with our reasoning processes, brain deterioration affects our ability to form new memories. Above all, concussion of the brain appears to destroy all memory of the events which immediately preceded the accident. Indeed, it is by the failure of the patient to remember what led up to that accident that the physician diagnoses concussion. This provides us with almost indisputable evidence that the means of remembering are the brain traces which require a little time for their assured establishment. That such brain traces do, in fact, exist, is very probable. And, moreover, it has been shown that the greater the ability of the individual to perform associative thinking, the more numerous and the more complex in their ramifications are the brain paths in question. Observer. We have now arrived within introductory range of that very meek-spirited creature known to modern science as the observer. It is a permanent obstacle in the path of our search for external reality that we can never entirely get rid of this individual. Picture the universe how we may, the picture remains of our making. On the other hand, it is, probably, equally true that, paint the picture how we will, we have to do it with the paints provided. But there is no reason why either of these limitations should invalidate the result regarded as a map by which we may safely set our course. Moreover, we can test it in that respect, and experience has shown that, thus tested, it proves reliable. Therein lies the justification of our search for knowledge. The general procedure in every science is to begin by the accurate tabulating of differences in what is observed. If we subsequently discover that these differences are due to the character or actions of the observer, we can note that such is the explanation of the difference and draft our science accordingly, but that addition to our knowledge does not invalidate our previous analysis of the differences as observed. All sciences deal only with a standard observer, unless the contrary is explicitly stated, and psychology is no exception to this rule. Its observer is assumed to be any normally constituted individual. Now, it must be admitted that the tenets of psychoneural parallelism are not very encouraging to this observer. For they suggest that, when the brain workings come to an end, the psychical phenomena cease likewise from troubling. Moreover, the scientific procedure of pushing the observer as far back as possible, so as to get as much as possible of the picture into the category of that which is observed, tends to reduce him to the level of a helpless onlooker with no more capacity for interference than has a member of a cinema audience the ability to alter the course of the story developing before him on the screen. nor is there much more comfort to be obtained from a study of the various metaphysical interpretations of this parallelism of mind and body. Idealist and realist may dispute hotly as to precisely how far the observer colors, so to say, the phenomena which he observes, but decisions arrived at in that respect need not suggest that he has any power of changing either the coloring he confers or the thing perceived as thus colored, much less the ability to continue observing when there is no longer any brain activity to be observed. Animism. In this connection, however, we must recognize the existence of a small but very vigorous group of philosophers known as animists. In this 20th century, the leading exponent of animism is indubitably Professor William McDougall, whose book, Body and Mind, sets out the arguments for and against the theory with scrupulous fairness. Indeed, I cannot call to mind anyone who has stated the case against animism with such devastating force. Animism holds that the observer is anything but an entity. He is no conscious automaton. He may, indeed, stand right outside the pictured universe, but he is a soul, with powers of intervention which enable him to alter the course of observed events, a mind which not only reads the brain, but which employs it as a tool. Much as the owner of an automatic piano may either listen to its playing or play on it himself. The inference is that this observer can survive the destruction of that brain which he observes. As for his intervention, there is no insuperable objection to that from the physical side. McDougall quotes and suggests various ways in which intervention could be effected without adding to or subtracting from the amount of energy in the nervous system. The man in the street is always at a loss to understand why the great majority of men of science are so coldly opposed to the idea of a soul. The religious man in particular cannot comprehend why his arguments should arouse not merely opposition, but bitter contempt. Yet the reason is not far to seek. It is not that the idea is attributed to man's inordinate conceit, for, all said and done, a navvy who can walk into a public house and order a pot of beer is an infinitely more wonderful thing than is the biggest lump of cooling mud that ever swam in the skies. But there can be no reasonable doubt that the idea of a soul must have first arisen in the mind of primitive man as the result of observation of his dreams. Ignorant as he was, he could have come to no other conclusion but that, in dreams, he left his sleeping body in one universe and went wandering off into another. It is considered that, but for that savage, the idea of such a thing as a soul would never have even occurred to mankind, so that arguments subsequently introduced to bolster up a case thus tainted at its source can have no claim to anyone's serious attention. Chapter 4 Presentations. Psychology must begin, then, by describing observed appearances without any prejudging of the issue as to what is the cause of these. So, though it may speak of such phenomena as if they were things, it must not be regarded as asserting that they are, at bottom, anything more than effects associated with brain workings. It leaves, at the outset, that question open. Field of presentation. All such phenomena it styles presentations, and it regards them as located within the individual's private field of presentation. This field of presentation contains, at any given instant of time, all the phenomena which happen to be offered for possible observation. Let us take a concrete example of what that means. You are now reading this book, and your field of presentation contains the visual phenomena connected with the printed letters of the word you are regarding. It contains also, at the same instant, the visual phenomenon pertaining to the little numeral at the bottom of the page. This you have failed to notice, but the numeral in question was, clearly, inside the area covered by your vision. It was affecting your brain via the eye. Its psychical correlate was being offered to your attention. And that statement holds good for a host of other visual phenomena. On reflection, you will also agree that the field must have then contained, presented to attention but left unnoticed, certain muscular sensations such as pressures 27 against your body, quite a number of sounds, and the pleasant feeling produced by the air flowing into your lungs as you breathed. Attention. It would be unsafe to say that these comparatively unnoticed phenomena were not being consciously observed. When you are watching a fall of snow, observation may be concentrated upon a single floating flake, but that does not mean that you fail to perceive the remainder. Were these to vanish, leaving the single flake in the air, their disappearance would instantly distract your startled attention from the object of your previous preoccupation. When listening to the playing of an orchestra, you do not need to cease following the music in order to be aware that the irritating person in the seat ahead has stopped beating time with his program. As a general rule, however, observation seems to be definitely centered upon one or another specific part of the crowd of presentations, though we have no psychical evidence to show that this is anything more than a matter of habit. Observation thus centered is called attention. It is usual to speak of the part of the field centered upon as being in the focus of attention, and it is a matter of common knowledge that, at and around this focus, attention may be concentrated in greater or less degree of intensity. In physiology, the field of presentation would be merely the particular part of the cerebrum which happens to be, at that moment, in the state of activity associated with the production of psychical phenomena. And the focus of attention would be simply that particular brain path which the maximum current of nervous energy happened to be following. One would be apt to suppose, offhand, that this maximum flow would be produced by whatever happened to be the greatest sensory stimulation. But such could not be the rule. The hungry man, coming to the luncheon table, has his attention focused, not upon the brightness of the shining silver, but upon the far duller sensory stimulation of the well-browned mutton chop. Attention, therefore, may be either attracted from without the organism or directed from within. If we were to attribute such directing to the ultimate observer, we should be admitting him to the status of a full-blown animus with powers of intervention. For, as every schoolboy knows, the concentrating of attention has a very marked effect in the formation of memories. But the physiologist would argue that we have no right to regard this internal directing of attention as originating in anything beyond the purely mechanical internal condition of the brain. Now, the field of presentation at any given moment may contain a great many observable phenomena besides those sensory appearances which we have been considering. It may contain, for example, memory images. What sort of a phenomenon is a memory image? Impressions. Presentations may be divided into two sharply differing classes. The first of these comprises all phenomena which appear to the observer as directly attributable to the action of his outer sensory organs or nerve endings. That they are truly associated with the activities of such surface machinery is evident from the fact that movement of, or external interference with, the organs or nerve endings in question results in an alteration of the character of the phenomena observed, and from the equally significant fact that, in the absence of such movements or interferences, the phenomena remain unaltered and unescapable. They cannot, in popular parlance, be the willed away. Such phenomena are styled impressions. Images. But now, picture to yourself a room which you remember. There is no doubt that what you are observing is a visual presentation, a mental picture. The process is not one of saying to yourself, "Let me see, there was a sofa in that corner, and a piano in the other, and the color of the carpet was such and such." Rather does the whole of what you remember come before your eyes in the form of a simultaneous vision. If, however, you want to make absolutely certain that such visual pictures are not things which you deliberately manufacture from a catalogue of verbally remembered detail, you may try the following experiment. Look carefully at a painting of a landscape, then, after half an hour, try to revisualize what you saw. You will find that you can re-observe much of the exact coloring of the original impressions, the peculiar olives and browns and grays, even though many of these colors were quite beyond your powers of artistic analysis, let alone verbal description. So you must be observing, as an image, an arrangement of colors similar to those which you saw as impressions. Reality tone. There is a difference between an impression and its related image which it has puzzled every psychologist to describe. It lies in the presence or absence of what is sometimes called sensory vividness, but what, I think, would be better referred to as reality tone. As compared with a room which you see with your eyes, the room you are remembering seems unreal, yet real enough to be recognizable as a visual, and not, say, an oral image. Again, strike the rim of a wine glass, and listen to the sound as it dies away. It grows fainter and fainter till it vanishes, but to the last it retains its reality tone. After it has entirely disappeared, you can remember what it sounded like just before it died away. That memory is recognizable as a memory of sound, an oral image. It has all the tonal qualities of the original faint impression, but it lacks the appearance of reality. Again, compare the true memory image with the phenomenon commonly called an after-impression. The latter may be easily observed. If you stare hard for 60 seconds at a brilliant red lampshade, and then look up at the ceiling, you will see, after a moment or so, a patch of green, shaped in outline like the lampshade. This phenomenon is dim, exhibits little, if any, detail within its boundaries, is of the opposite color to the original impression, and lacks all perspective, seeming to be flat all over. It possesses, however, reality tone, and is clearly an impression. It moves as you move your eyes. But, while actually watching this green patch floating before you, you can observe a true memory image of the original impression of the lampshade. It is of the original red color, exhibits much internal detail, and appears to be three-dimensional, i.e., to possess the depth apparent to binocular vision. 5 minutes later, when all trace of the green after impression has vanished, you can observe clear memory images of either red lampshade or green patch. It may be noted, then, that images are phenomena quite distinct from mere fading impressions. The reader should distinguish between the focusing of attention and the performing of body movements to assist observation. With his eyes focused upon a dull object before him, he can focus attention upon a brighter object in his field of vision. And he can, subsequently, shift the focus of vision to the brighter object.